Blackwood, my hometown, lay quietly at the end of the 19th century, enveloped in a dark and enigmatic atmosphere. The narrow cobblestone streets echoed the footsteps of the few passers-by who dared to walk after dusk. The stone houses, with their weathered facades, seemed to watch silently, guarding unconfessed secrets. In the village of Blackwood, I was a figure known to all. I worked at the small local bakery, where, every morning, my skilled hands shaped hot bread and sweets that filled the air with a comforting aroma. While attending to the residents, it was common to see me murmuring prayers softly, as if each loaf was an offering of faith. My presence brought a brief sense of normalcy amid the constant atmosphere of fear that permeated the village. At nightfall, I would head to the chapel, a place that offered me a refuge of tranquility and introspection. There, I dedicated myself to my prayers with a devotion that inspired respect and admiration. The flickering candles cast soft shadows on the stone walls, creating an environment that, though somber, seemed to embrace me with spiritual warmth. The chapel was not just a workplace, but also my home, where I found peace and rest. However, even in my nightly routine of prayers and meditations, I was not completely immune to the unease of Blackwood. Sometimes, while praying, I felt an almost tangible presence, as if I were not alone. Fear whispered in my heart, but my faith kept me firm. I knew something was coming, something that could challenge even my unwavering faith. It was during a stormy night that William appeared for the first time in the chapel. The door creaked as it opened, and for a moment, I thought the wind had blown in stronger than usual. However, when I looked up, I saw the trembling figure of a man, wet and visibly disturbed. He reeked of alcohol and had eyes brimming with despair. "Please, I need to confess my sins," he said, almost in a whisper, as if he feared being heard by anyone other than me. He knelt before the altar, his hands shaking so much that he could barely find the words. His voice, broken with emotion, revealed a life once respectable, now destroyed by loneliness and addiction. "I was a decent man," he began, "but loneliness drove me to the bars, and alcohol became my only companion." As he spoke, I felt a wave of compassion, mixed with an inexplicable sense that there was something darker about his presence. While William confessed, the storm outside seemed to intensify, as if the very sky reacted to his torment. The shadows danced on the chapel walls, and a chill ran down my spine. It was not just the cold of the night, it was something deeper, a presence that seemed to feed on William's despair. Even so, my faith compelled me to help him, to extend a hand to this man lost in the darkness. Seeing the despair in William's eyes, I felt an inexplicable compassion that drove me to help him. I had heard many stories of suffering in the chapel, some even more touching than William's, but something about his presence touched me differently. Perhaps it was the palpable fear emanating from him, a fear that seemed to resonate with something deep within me. "You are not alone," I said, lightly touching his shoulder. "We will work together to lift you up." He nodded, though his eyes were still filled with the shadow of doubt and fear. The next day, I took William to the bakery, where he could occupy his hands and mind with simple tasks. I taught him to knead the dough and tend to the oven, hoping that manual labor would help distract his dark thoughts. He seemed grateful, and slowly began to show signs of improvement. There were moments when he got lost in daydreams, but I was always nearby to bring him back to reality. Perhaps, in some way, I felt that by helping William, I was also facing my own fears. As the days passed, William became a constant presence by my side. He helped with small chores and, gradually, began to open his heart to me. He told me stories of his life before everything fell apart, of the dreams he once had. However, there was always a tone of melancholy in his voice, as if he knew something terrible was still to come. And deep down, I also felt there was more to his story than he let on. The sense of a constant and disturbing presence never completely left me. The days following William's arrival were marked by a growing sense of strangeness in the village. Rumors began to circulate that I was talking to myself in the bakery. The villagers whispered among themselves, casting furtive glances in my direction when they thought I wasn't looking. "Did you see Eleanor this morning?" She was talking to herself again. I heard someone whisper as I passed through the square. Those comments made me uneasy, but I could not abandon William. One morning, while preparing a meal for William in the bakery, I noticed something truly disturbing. I placed a plate before him and returned to the counter. When I looked again, the food had disappeared, but no one besides me seemed to notice his presence. "William, are you enjoying the food?" I asked, hoping for a response that would confirm his existence. The silence in the bakery was almost deafening, and a strange chill began to take hold of me. The shadows on the walls seemed to dance sinisterly, projected by the weak sunlight filtering through the dusty windows. Despite the unsettling whispers and growing doubts, I continued to help William, determined to ignore the disturbing signs. However, the sense of something wrong lingered in the air, becoming increasingly palpable. Sometimes, when I was alone in the bakery, I felt a cold presence behind me, but when I turned, there was no one there. Fear whispered in my heart, and the shadows seemed denser and more threatening. I knew I needed to discover the truth about William before my sanity was completely consumed by the growing darkness. At night, the chapel became my refuge, a place where I sought to find peace amid the growing discomfort that William brought. He also stayed there, but something strange happened while I slept. Whenever I woke up in the middle of the night, William was not by my side. I felt a cold presence around me, as if something dark was lurking in the chapel's shadows. "William, where are you?" My voice echoed off the stone walls, but there was no answer. One of those nights, I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The candles in the chapel were almost extinguished, casting flickering, frightening shadows. I walked slowly down the dark corridor, calling for William. When I finally found him, he was standing still, staring intently at a spot on the wall. "William, are you all right?" I asked, but he did not respond, his eyes empty and lifeless. The fear I felt was almost tangible, as if a malevolent presence was always lurking, ready to envelop me in its cold grip. Something was terribly wrong, and with each passing day, the line between reality and illusion became more tenuous. These nocturnal episodes left deep marks on my mind. I began to doubt my own sanity. During the day, William seemed normal, but at night, his presence transformed into something terrifying. The shadows in the chapel seemed to take on a life of their own, and the whispers, once distant, were now deafening. I knew I needed to understand what was happening before the darkness completely consumed my soul. With the growing sense that something was not right, I decided to investigate William's history more thoroughly. I began asking the villagers, hoping to find someone who might remember him. "Do you know a man named William?" I asked, receiving only confused looks and denials. No one seemed to have any memory of him, which only heightened my fear and uncertainty. Each negative response was like a blow to my already shaken sense of reality. Determined to find answers, I sought out the chapel's priest, a wise man knowledgeable about the village's old stories. "Father, do you know anyone named William?" "He recently appeared here," I asked, hoping for a response that would ease my worries. The priest frowned, looking deeply concerned. "No, Eleanor, I don't know anyone by that name. Perhaps you should rest more, you seem very disturbed." His words, instead of calming me, only increased my anguish. My nights became even more restless. I began searching the chapel, looking for any clues that might explain William's presence. There was something disturbing about the entire situation, something I could not fully understand. My search for answers led me to an old locked room in the chapel, a place I had never explored before. With some difficulty, I managed to open the heavy wooden door. Inside, among dust and darkness, I found an old mirror, framed by carved figures that seemed to watch me with empty eyes. When I looked into the mirror, I felt a chill run down my spine. Reflected there, beside me, was William, but he seemed different, tormented, like a spirit trapped between two worlds. The following days were marked by disturbing visions. Whenever I looked into the mirror, scenes from the past unfolded before my eyes. I saw myself alone, sitting on the chapel pews, praying fervently. William was not by my side, as I had remembered. These visions showed me a reality I did not want to accept, that perhaps William had never really been there. Each glimpse was like a blow to my sanity, revealing a truth my heart feared to face. In a state of growing desperation, I sought out the chapel's priest again. I felt the need to share the visions that tormented me. "Father, I've been seeing things," I began, my voice trembling. "William, he appears in the mirror, but he seems like a tormented spirit. And there are shadows, whispers." The priest looked at me with concern, a shadow of recognition crossing his face. "Eleanor, this chapel has a long and complicated history. There have been rumors of hauntings since its construction." The conversation with the priest left me even more uneasy. He advised me to be cautious and pray for my own sanity, but his words seemed laden with fear and something more, perhaps a personal experience with the supernatural. "There is something malevolent here, Eleanor. Something that feeds on despair and confusion. You must be strong and keep your faith." His words echoed in my mind but did not bring the comfort I had hoped for. Instead, they fueled my dread. That night, the priest's words would not leave me in peace. Desperate for answers, I decided to visit the village's old cemetery, hoping to find something that would clarify William's true nature. The cemetery, with its time-worn, moss-covered tombstones, exuded an atmosphere of melancholy and abandonment. As I walked among the graves, I felt the presence of something dark watching my every move. The cold wind whispered through the trees, bringing with it a growing sense of oppression and fear. After hours of searching, I found a tombstone that made my heart stop. "William," I read aloud, "died in 1872. The date indicated that he had died decades before our meeting in the chapel. The revelation was a devastating shock, confirming my worst fears. My legs trembled, and an intense cold took hold of me, as if the very earth were trying to swallow me. The presence I felt beside me seemed to intensify, enveloping me in a suffocating darkness. As I knelt before William's tombstone, tears streaming down my face, a voice whispered my name, so cold and threatening that it made my blood run cold. "Eleanor, you cannot escape," the voice said. I stood up, terrified, and ran out of the cemetery, fear driving every step. The shadows seemed to reach out to grab me, and the whispers followed me to the chapel. The discovery in the cemetery confirmed that William was a tormented spirit, trapped by a malevolent entity that now turned its full attention to me. After the revelation in the cemetery, my world fell apart. The truth was clear: William had never been real, at least not in a physical sense. He was a spirit trapped by the malevolent entity that haunted the chapel. William's presence became more disturbing. Now, he appeared not only in my dreams but also during the day, like a persistent shadow. "Eleanor, you must help me," he said, his voice echoing like a lament through the stone walls. His form was pale and distorted, his eyes, once full of despair, now empty and apathetic. Each encounter with him increased my sense of dread and helplessness, while the entity seemed to delight in my torment. As the days passed, the line between reality and illusion completely dissolved. I began to see shadows moving in the corners of the chapel, spectral figures whispering my name and promising eternal despair. My body trembled constantly, and fear invaded every thought, every breath. I was being consumed, and the malevolent presence knew it. I felt on the verge of losing everything: my faith, my sanity, my very soul. The only certainty that remained was the need to confront this entity before it was too late. Desperation consumed me as I tried desperately to flee the village. I left the chapel with my heart racing, running through the deserted streets of Blackwood, illuminated only by the faint light of street lamps and the occasional flash of lightning. Every corner I turned seemed to bring me back to the starting point, as if the village were conspiring to trap me. Fear whispered in my mind, and the malevolent presence seemed always one step behind, whispering promises of eternal despair. The sensation of being trapped in a repetitive cycle was suffocating. The streets I knew so well now seemed strange and labyrinthine, and the shadows extended like hands trying to grab me. "You will never escape," whispered a guttural voice, echoing in the dark alleys. Every attempt to find an exit was frustrated by streets that turned into dead ends. My breathing was heavy, and my body trembled with exhaustion and fear. The darkness seemed to envelop me, making escape impossible. Finally, I found myself back at the chapel, the place where it had all begun. The door was ajar, and the darkness inside seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I knew there was nowhere else to run. I entered, resigned to face whatever awaited me. The chapel was silent, but the air was heavy with an oppressive presence. "You cannot escape from me," the voice whispered one last time, and I knew the final battle was about to begin. Fear was now my only companion as I prepared to confront the entity that had pursued me to that moment. Back at the chapel, the truth began to reveal itself in a terrible and inexorable way. As I wandered through the dark space, I was drawn to a set of old books and forgotten documents in a dusty corner. There, among yellowed and fragile pages, I found accounts of an ancient cult that performed dark rituals on the ground long before the chapel was built. The descriptions were chilling: human sacrifices, invocation of malevolent entities, and a blood pact that promised power in exchange for eternal servitude. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. William was not just a tormented spirit, he was a victim of these rituals, trapped by the malevolent entity the cult had invoked. His spirit was used as a vehicle to perpetuate the cycle of terror and despair that plagued the chapel, and now, I was the next in line. "Eleanor, you must understand," William whispered in my thoughts. "I was trapped here by this force, and it feeds on our fear." Each word increased my horror, but also my determination to end this. With Lydia's diary and the cult's accounts in hand, I comprehended the magnitude of the entity I faced. This was no mere haunting, but an ancient and powerful force, fed by human despair over the centuries. The link between William and the entity was now clear, a cycle of torment that needed to be broken. "I will not let it continue," I murmured to myself, with renewed determination. I knew I would face the darkness and the entity itself in a final confrontation, but the truth had armed me with the knowledge needed to fight. The battle for my soul and William's liberation was about to begin. I resolved that night would be the last I spent in the chapel, a final confrontation against the entity that had so terrified me. I entered the building with a heavy heart but firm in my decision. The atmosphere was more oppressive than ever, with shadows moving unsettlingly and whispers growing in intensity. "I can no longer run," I thought, as I walked slowly down the central aisle. The candles trembled, casting distorted figures on the stone walls. The entity manifested with overwhelming force, its presence stronger and more malevolent than ever. I felt a glacial cold envelop me, and the whispers became almost deafening. "Eleanor, you cannot escape," the entity's guttural voice resonated through the chapel, each word a blow to my sanity. I closed my eyes, trying to focus on my breathing and my faith, remembering Lydia's diary and William's words. "You will not defeat me," I murmured, my voice trembling but resolute. At the climax of the confrontation, the entity tried to break my will, flooding my mind with visions of terror and despair. I felt on the verge of collapse, but something within me refused to yield. It was then that Lydia's figure appeared, a soft and protective glow emanating from her. "Eleanor, you are not alone," her voice was calm and comforting. With her help, I felt a renewed wave of strength. Together, we faced the entity, creating a spiritual barrier that seemed to weaken its power. The malevolent presence began to waver, and I knew there was a chance to win. Knowing the confrontation was far from over, I prepared for the necessary sacrifice to deceive the entity. However, my plan was risky and fraught with uncertainties. "If it must be done," I murmured, my heart heavy, "then so be it." The entity seemed to perceive my determination, its shadows frantically stirring around me. The chapel trembled with the intensity of the malevolent presence, as if the very walls were trying to resist the approaching terror. I placed myself before the altar, offering myself as a sacrifice. "I am here," I declared aloud, my voice resonating through the chapel. "Take me and leave this village in peace." For a moment, everything was silent, a silence so deep it seemed to swallow time itself. The entity then emerged, more powerful than ever, its distorted forms enveloping me in a cold embrace. Finally, the voice whispered, "You will be mine." But at the last moment, I realized the true nature of the entity's plan. It did not just want my soul, but intended to use my sacrifice to attract more victims, perpetuating the cycle of despair. "No!" I shouted, my voice echoing with renewed strength. I focused all my will and faith, resisting the power that tried to consume me. Lydia's presence shone more intensely beside me, her combative light repelling the darkness. The entity roared in rage, but its power began to waver. The battle was not won, but the tide was starting to turn in my favor. In the darkest moment of the confrontation, I felt Lydia's presence beside me, her soft and protective light cutting through the surrounding darkness. "Eleanor, we can face this together." Her voice was an anchor of serenity in the sea of terror enveloping me. Feeling her strength, I gathered my last reserves of courage and faith. The entity roared in fury, its shadows contorting and trying to envelop us, but Lydia's presence was an impenetrable barrier. We united our spiritual forces, creating a barrier of light that seemed to repel the entity. The chapel, once pulsating with malevolent energy, began to vibrate with a new force, an energy of resistance and hope. "You cannot defeat us," I declared, my voice firm despite the lingering fear in my heart. Lydia and I advanced, the light around us growing and pushing the darkness back. Each step felt like a small victory, but the entity was not yet defeated. The spiritual struggle was intense and exhausting. The entity launched its final forces against us, but with Lydia by my side, I managed to resist. The light emanating from us became a torrent, a wave that washed the chapel of its accumulated darkness. The entity, with a scream of pure fury and despair, began to fade, its distorted forms dissolving in the light. "We're almost there," Lydia whispered, and I felt a deep peace beginning to settle in the chapel. The entity was losing its power, and for the first time in a long time, I saw a glimmer of hope. With the entity weakened, I knew it was time to free William. I took Lydia's diary, containing the instructions for the liberation ritual. "Let's end this," I said to Lydia, whose presence gave me strength. I recited the words written in the diary, my voice echoing through the chapel as the ritual's power began to manifest. The light around us intensified, creating a glow that seemed to pierce the stone walls and reach the sky itself. William appeared before us, his countenance still tormented but with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Eleanor, you are so close," he said, his voice filled with emotion. I continued the ritual, feeling the energy flowing through me. Each word seemed to weaken the entity further, while William's figure became more solid and less ethereal. The chapel seemed to breathe with new life, and the shadows receded before the growing light. Finally, the moment arrived. With one last powerful chant, I felt the connection between William and the entity break. When the light finally dissipated, the chapel was at peace. The candles burned with a steady and serene flame, and the air was clear and light. The oppressive presence that had dominated the place was completely absent. "Thank you, Eleanor," William whispered, his voice full of gratitude. "You have freed me." With those words, he disappeared, his spirit finally at peace. The chapel was silent, but for the first time in a long while, it was a silence of tranquility, not fear. The chapel, now bathed in a gentle and calming light, seemed a completely different place. The entity, weakened by the ritual, made a last desperate effort to regain control. The remaining shadows writhed violently, trying to reach Lydia and me. "You cannot defeat us," I declared firmly, feeling the light around us pulse with renewed strength. The entity, with a final scream of fury, began to fade, its distorted forms dissolving in the brilliant light that filled the chapel. Lydia's presence became even stronger beside me, her light repelling the last vestiges of darkness. "We're almost there, Eleanor," she whispered, her voice full of hope. The entity, realizing its imminent defeat, made one last attack. The shadows tried to envelop me, but Lydia's light and my combined faith created an impenetrable barrier. The entity screamed in agony and despair, and in one final flash of light, it disintegrated completely. When the light finally dissipated, the chapel was at peace. The candles burned with a steady and serene flame, and the air was clear and light. The oppressive presence that had dominated the place was completely absent. Lydia looked at me with a grateful smile and slowly disappeared, her mission fulfilled. The chapel, now purified, became a sanctuary of true peace and hope. I felt a deep calm and renewed inner strength, knowing the entity had been defeated forever. With the entity defeated, I began to feel my sanity slowly returning. The days that followed were marked by a peace I had not felt in a long time. The whispers and shadows disappeared, replaced by the comforting sound of prayers and the gentle glow of candles. I resumed my activities in the bakery, feeling renewed energy in every task. The villagers, now aware of what I had faced, looked at me with respect and admiration, offering words of support and gratitude. The village of Blackwood, once shrouded in constant shadow, began to show signs of revitalization. The people, once fearful and withdrawn, began to open up more to each other. The chapel became a symbol of hope and redemption, a place where residents could find solace and renew their faith. I felt more connected to the community than ever, each interaction a confirmation that the worst was over. "Eleanor, you are our heroine," some said, their words warming my heart. My mind, once tormented by visions and fears, was now clear and focused. The memories of William and Lydia remained, but without the weight of despair. They were now memories of courage and resilience. I began using my experience to help others, listening to their stories and offering advice based on my own journey. The darkness that once threatened to consume me had been banished, and in its place, I found a strength and peace I never imagined possible. With the chapel purified and peace restored, the village of Blackwood found a new beginning. The chapel, once a place of terror, became a sanctuary of light and hope. The villagers now frequented the place not only to pray but also to gather and share stories of overcoming adversity. The candles burned with a steady and bright flame, symbolizing the victory over the darkness that once threatened our community. I felt my mission was just beginning, with a renewed purpose in helping others find peace and solace. I decided to stay in the village, dedicating myself to strengthening community bonds and protecting Blackwood from any future threats. The chapel, where I once found only fear, was now my spiritual home. I organized regular gatherings where we discussed ways to keep the village safe and welcoming. Each person who crossed the chapel's threshold brought a piece of hope, and together, we built a brighter future. My faith, once shaken, was now an unshakable rock that guided my actions and decisions. I looked to the future with confidence, knowing that although I had faced darkness, I had emerged stronger and wiser. The village of Blackwood thrived under the new dawn, and I was determined to ensure the light would never be extinguished again. "We are all in this together," I told the villagers, "and together, we can face anything." With this spirit of unity and resilience, Blackwood flourished, and I found my place, not just as a guardian of the chapel, but as a community leader dedicated to protecting and inspiring everyone around me. Now, at the end of this scary and twist-filled story, I would like to ask, have you ever gone through something that left you as scared as Eleanor? Share your experiences in the comments. Stories like these remind us of the importance of community and faith, even in the darkest moments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to continue hearing more intriguing and mysterious stories. Your participation is essential for us to share even more content that you love. See you in the next terrifying story.